to have the pleasure of Will Fitch, the Warden at Wheatfen, here to tell you all about it. My name is Cassie Terry. I'm a member of the South Year Wildlife Group Committee, and I think maybe we've got one or two people who we haven't seen before, which is absolutely fantastic. It's hopefully a friendly group of people with interests in nature and conservation, and we have a full programme of events and activities right the way through the year, from talks to hopefully also practical things and socials, and it's just a nice thing to be part of. If you're interested in joining after tonight, please do give one of us in the committee at the back mostly a shout, and we can tell you more about it. Or indeed, if you want to join the committee, we're always looking for new members, so that would be great. If you don't mind, I'll just tell you the format for the night. I do have a few more announcements to make, then we'll have a talk and hopefully a Q&A. The talk will last about an hour.
About that, yep.
Hopefully time for Q&A, and then we'll have some refreshments. We are hoping, if nobody minds, to film the talk so that it can be put on the website and YouTube, and also take a couple of pictures from the back. Would anybody have any issues with that? Great, because the more people know about, or have the benefit of the talks and know about the work of the group, the better. So that'd be, thank you for that. Fire exit is here, the back. And I just needed to tell you a few forthcoming events. Our next talk will be, if you go down to the woods today, and we're very lucky to have Anne Edwards, who was the person who first noticed ash dieback in the UK, and she's a real expert on it, and she's been basically looking after Ashworth Woods with her volunteers there for many, many years, and she'll be able to tell us how it's done and what the progress is with the ash dieback. So looking forward to that, and that is in Wednesday the 26th of February, Bergacton Village Hall, and I'd like to see some of you there for that. We also are having our AGM, that is the 1st of April, and we will have Matt Wickens from North Wildlife Trust speaking as the main speaker for that. We'll be having breakfast with the birds, which is our lovely, very early morning walk around, followed by a really nice breakfast to look forward to at the beginning of May. And I've been asked to mention that the 5 Mile Network will be resuming its meetings in March, date TBC. Right, so the name of Ted Ellis will of course be very familiar to all Norfolk people. Norfolk's best known naturalist, curator, writer, generally wonderful and enigmatic person who did so much to publicise and promote conservation in the days before it even had the name of conservation. Ted's daily columns in the EDP daily for 40 years, and his meticulous recording of the beauty and the wonder of his marsh home or marshland home at Wheatfen, and recording in his diaries are known to you all. And he's rightly won the accolade of the people's naturalist. But his real legacy is the work that carries on today with, I think his wife Phyllis, in the days after his death, was the prime mover in getting the trust established, and with the trustees and the volunteers keep it running today. Thankfully, it's in Will's safe hands. Will Fitch has been Warden for around 8 years. You hail from Wales, Will, and you found your way via Lincolnshire to Norfolk, I believe, where your long-standing interest in natural history firstly got you into Eton College, and you've also studied at Leicester. And before you were here, I believe you were up in North Norfolk as ranger there for a few years. And now, single-handed with the help of your assistant, Rebecca, and the trustees, Will runs a team of 50 people who maintain the whole of the nature reserve, look after events, they do it all. But I better not steal your thunder, hand over to you, and ladies and gentlemen, would you give a big round of applause to Will Fitch.
Thank you. Right, thank you all for coming. Shall we turn the front two lights out, please? Once. Wait for it. Wait for it. Can you all hear me okay at the back? Yeah. Brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you for inviting me. As we just heard, I've been at Wheatfen for nearly 8 years. The previous warden, David Nobbs, who many of you may know personally, was at Wheatfen, I think, 27 years. So I'm not quite there yet. I'm still referred to as the new warden sometimes. I think, new warden, who's that? But there we are. Reg at the back, he invited me to do this talk a while ago, so we'll blame him if it's terrible. I'm sure it won't be. But yes, I will start the talk by talking about Ted Ellis, which many of you may remember from TV, radio, 1909 to 1986. And Ted was actually born on the Isle of Guernsey. I'm sure most of you don't need a map. I'm sure your geography is far better than mine. His parents were Yarmouth-based, travelling on their honeymoon to the Isle of Guernsey, found work, and there Ted was born. There's a young Ted Ellis, all dressed up in his garden, wandering around. And so I've read his first words, which you think would be the typical mummy. I'm hoping my little boy will say daddy in a few weeks' time. Ted's first words, bold insect, when a fly landed on his pram. So it's almost like natural history was in him from day one. And there's young Ted. He was allowed to roam the Isle of Guernsey to explore. He would be dressed up in a bright orange pullover, the high vis of the day, so his mum Alice could see him from afar, and he would roam around, rock pooling and looking for nests and chicks and all sorts of things. And he also made a very big error in his early life, one that he learnt from, and one perhaps that we all can learn from, in that he found a nest of robin chicks. And he kept watching it really close and interfering almost. And he's like, well, where's the parents? Why aren't they feeding these robin chicks? So he thought, I know, I'll go get some sweet treats, some biscuits, and I'll crumble them into the nest and around the tree. And he went away, forgot about it, came back a bit later. To his horror, the ants had crawled up the tree, chasing the crumbs, eating the sugary snacks, and killed the chicks. So he realised from a very young age, sometimes it's best just to stand back, to observe, to monitor, to look, and then perhaps make a decision on management. Unlike the children of today, the square-eyed children who love their games and PlayStations, I think Rose here has proved us wrong that if you offer a facility, a forest school, kids absolutely love it. Perhaps not the parents on the cold, wet days. So 10 years on, and young Ted was to move back to Yarmouth. His words, not mine. He was quite disappointed at first with the landscape of Yarmouth. A bit flat, perhaps not as interesting, but Ted being Ted, he soon got back into wandering around, roaming and exploring. He had a shed, and in his shed he would keep all sorts of finds, skins and fossils and bones. I'd imagine there was quite a smell coming out from it. And Ted, even as a young teenager, undertook his own research. One study I particularly liked was he went around and collected as many different snail species as possible. He dropped them all in a bucket of water to see which ones could swim. Of course, there was some fatalities, but that's good research for a child. How else would you know if snails can swim? And there's a young Ted, perhaps in his early 20s, and he recorded everything that he found in quite good notebooks, very in-depth. And you can see his illustrations, there's a nice moorhen there and a plant. He's really getting into the depth of these species. He'd even look at the roots. So he wouldn't just name a plant, he'd then study it and he'd think, well, what's pollinating it? Is there any rust fungi on it? And then he'd find the fungi on top of the rust fungi. You can see the sort of knowledge that he had. And he was encouraged in his early days by this gentleman, Arthur Henry Patterson, his pseudonym John No Little, local man up at Yarmouth again, had a little boat that he lived on, and Ted would go from a young age to help Arthur Henry Patterson type up his notes. And I'd recommend some of these books. He often writes in old Norfolk dialect, the old poachers and wildfowlers, and you almost feel like you're one of them as you're reading the books. But he really encouraged Ted to keep recording, to keep studying. And we recently found this painting in the Norwich Archive, and there's Mr. Patterson with Ted. We be nature chums. Be a great poster, I think, even 100 years on. Now, one key figure in Ted's life would be Phyllis Ellis, his wife-to-be. This, of course, is not Phyllis. It's a plant, large marsh sow thistle. And back in the late 20s, it was incredibly rare. There's only a few sites in Norfolk you could see this plant. It's now a lot more abundant. It thrives at Wheatfen. I did read there's a record for the height, about 2.4 metres. I'm going to beat it. I think tomato feed, plenty of feed, we'll get a new record. Anyway, so yeah, Ted knew where these plants lived, where they grew, and one day, to his horror, he found someone very close to these plants. So he was marching up to her saying, "Oi, what are you doing?" It was Phyllis, studying botany, his future wife-to-be. And Phyllis plays a key part in the role of Wheatfen, the setting up of the nature reserve, and I'll talk more about Phyllis in a bit. Legendary koi pew casserole. Nothing was wasted in the Ellis household. They were trapping thousands of koi pew that were decimating the banks of rivers, eating all the sugar beet. They caught them, ate them. Don't know if I fancy it myself. A bit like a rat pie, isn't it? And there's Ted with his fantastic koi pew hat. Another fantastic story I often tell the volunteers is when you used to volunteer when Phyllis was alive. She passed away in 2004. She'd often make a nice soup. And one day one of them vegetarians turned up, perhaps not such a big thing back then. And Phyllis said, "No matter, I'll knock you up a special vegetarian soup." Well, the vegetarian was eating this soup quite happily until a pheasant claw was discovered in the bottom of the bowl. Yes. Another day, Wheatfen badly flooded. Phyllis on her own. Local policeman comes down to check on her. She's playing the piano in her wellies, so you can see the kind of lady Phyllis was. And yeah, Ted applied for his early job, which he'd spent a couple of decades doing in the Castle Museum. No formal qualifications, all he had was those fantastic notebooks, his drawings, his observations. He applied and he became the curator of natural history. And what a place to work, to study, to research, to identify things. He was instrumental in setting up the dioramas, many of which are still there today. And before these displays of habitats, of ecosystems, you'd have a bit of a stuffed tawny owl in a case. Very nice to look at. But Ted said, let's see the whole habitat. And yeah, still there to this day. And it was one day while Ted was working away in the castle, he met this chap here. Here's Ted. Not sure who this gentleman is, but this man here is called Captain Cockle. And he lived at Wheatfen in the 30s and 40s. And he turned up at the castle with a tray of molluscs, dozens of species, and he said to Ted, "Could you help me identify these molluscs?" And Ted was like, "Well, yes, of course. Where did you find them?" And Captain Cockle said, "Well, they all came out of my sort of my backyard, my estate." And Ted said, "Well, no, these didn't all come from one place. Such was the diversity. You must have found these across several estates, half of Norfolk." And Captain Cockle said, "Nope. We found these at my home at Wheatfen. Come down and have a look." And Ted did. And he came down every week afterwards, and he studied and he researched and he recorded as much of the flora and fauna as he could. 1946, Captain Cockle passed away, and the house was offered to the Ellises and the estate. Of course, they jumped on it. Who wouldn't? They said, "Yes, we'd love to move in, to rent, eventually to buy." And that's how they came to Wheatfen Nature Reserve. Now, I'm sure this map is not really necessary for you local people. So when I go to Heverset Horticultural Society and they're like, "Well, where's Wheatfen?" I think, well, where is Wheatfen? We've got Rockland Broad here, the patisserie in the local farm, Yare Valley Farm. Strumpshaw, our neighbours, the other side of the river. One warden once said to me, "Oh, Will, it'd be great to have a bridge. We could connect the two reserves together." I said, "No thanks. We don't want that lot coming over here, do we?" They're good neighbours. Good to have RSPB as neighbours. The farmer's not too bad either. And yeah, Ted would spend the next 40 years studying Wheatfen, potentially discovering thousands of species. I say potentially because we're now trying to bring all this data together. Much of it is handwritten or in Word documents, Excel. Thankfully, I have a trainer who loves that kind of thing. Give her a load of Excel spreadsheets and say combine them together and she's on it. So that saves me that hassle. One of Ted's discoveries, new to science, was a rust fungi on bog myrtle. And he found the rust fungi on birch and alder and hazel catkins. And he said, well, why has no one ever recorded one on bog myrtle? He went, he looked, he found. So it just shows, you know, the detail he's looking at, the observations. And here's the house. People would visit from far and wide. All sorts of different naturalists from across the UK to study the flora and fauna of Wheatfen. They were all given a bed, somewhere to stay in the Ellis household, which is remarkable because Ted was apparently a bit of a spreader. Now, this is not actually Ted's house. It's just my own personal vision of it, I guess. Don't you feel sorry for Phyllis? The one rule was not to walk around at night because Ted was studying the slugs. And you see, Ted had lovely painted toenails. But you can sort of imagine that all these fantastic naturalists coming along with all their kit and surveying equipment, all being given a koi poo casserole and a bed, and you go to have a bath and there's a heron, and that was Ted who used to rescue things, rehabilitate things. So it must have been a great joy to meet all these different people. And well, at Wheatfen, out on the fen, there's still strange things today that people come along and think, well, what's this doing here? Broad-leaved ragwort, not native. I think it was introduced about 400 years ago to a handful of sites. Why? Why did Ted bring this to Wheatfen in the 50s? Well, he was trying to reintroduce large copper butterflies. You won't see it very well, it's just on his hand. Sadly, we lost the large copper about the 1850s, and various efforts have been made to bring it back, all of which failed. Ted thought, if I could just provide a late nectar source, an extra helping hand for these butterflies, broadleaf ragwort, flowering in August, that will help them out. But sadly, the reintroductions never took off. But the ragwort still persists and not really doing any harm, not out-competing anything. Good story to it, and again, I'm sure it is a late nectar source to many invertebrates. And Ted would go on to be known for all sorts of publications. This particular one here, I've got lots of copies of. Special offer, £10, all sorts of articles from Ted in the EDP, Guardian and so on. Fantastic writing, quite poetic at times, but also very informative. He would go on to produce the Collins New Naturalist book, The Broads, which at that time in the 60s we were discovering the origin of the Broads. Joyce Lambert's discovering how the Broads were actually man-made. They were dug for peat. This was all put together by Ted in this one volume. And of course, many of you remember Ted from the TV. There he is. I reckon he's got a nice giant hogweed there, which we all know we wouldn't really want to touch a living one. Could blind you if you get it in your eyes. Quite an evil plant. People would send Ted all sorts of good stuff in little boxes and things. Of course, if Ted was away for a week, he'd come back to the BBC office, much to his boss's dismay. So all sorts, again, funny smells and creepy crawlies escaping from various things that have been posted. Yeah, towards the end of his days, he again was so well known, the People's Naturalist, responding to all letters, encouraging people to come to Wheatfen. He took the late Queen round at the opening of Ranworth Broad. He was also given an honorary doctorate degree for his research into natural history. Considering he had no real schooling, that's quite something. And again, his artwork still displayed in a lot of articles today on a lot of websites because it was just right up there. You can see a very talented man with writing and art and natural history. And yeah, it always seems a bit shame to come to an end with discussion on Ted, but there's so much more to talk about with the current Wheatfen, the management, the species we have now and the future. But again, I always say, if you fancy a guided walk in the summer, drop us a line and we'll arrange something and we can again talk about a lot more anecdotes. But sadly, Ted passed away in 1986. He's buried up the road at St Saviour's, in the ruined chapel there. I think his only gripe would be that noisy old A47. I think that was built around the 80s, early 80s, so he would have heard the initial sort of traffic, but obviously nothing to what it is today. But a lovely view across the fen, with Phyllis buried beside him. And there's Phyllis. So 86, poor old Ted has passed away, and all his friends and family get together and say, what shall we do to remember Ted? Such a legacy of research. And so, Phyllis being Phyllis, well, who better to get than a celebrity of his day, David Bellamy. And this is the famous quote that many of you may have seen before. I'll read it out in case you can't see it at the back. David Bellamy said at the launch of the Ted Ellis Trust in '87, Wheatfen Broad is, in its way, as important as Mount Everest or the giant redwood forests of North America. It's probably the best bit of fenland we have because we know so much about it. That is purely because one man gave his life trying to understand it, Ted Ellis. And again, it's that years and years of recording. When we do get our list together, it'll be interesting to see what we have, because Wick and Fenn have always said we have more species here than anywhere else, more recorded. I'm not so sure, we might be there. So yeah, Phyllis and the family decided to sell the land to form the Ted Ellis Trust. They retained the house and a bit of woodland. She galvanised volunteers, she got signs in place. Of course, you know, it was Ted's estate, Ted's garden, and formal nature reserve needs safety features, bridges. You couldn't have things like this anymore. Even so, Phyllis was incredibly thoughtful with how to build paths and bridges. Old radiators, still finding to this day, buried in paths just to get you over a wet hole. Norwich Castle, I don't think this is Norwich Castle, but not Norwich Castle, Norwich Prison I should say. We're getting rid of all their old wooden beds. Phyllis said, well, I'll have them old prison beds and I'll lay them down a long pathway because that will bind the ground and stop you getting wet feet. So you can see how resourceful she was. Path names, once the paths have been made, they needed to have a name, and so I'm walking around the fen and saying I'm just going to nip down Penguin Dyke, and you think, what's he going on about? Where's the penguins? Well, this is an Only Fools and Horses story of during the war, and many of you may know that there was a false airfield in Surlingham. The German Luftwaffe are coming over, peppering the landscape with bombs. Several fell at Wheatfen. One made as a pond, which has since been widened and dredged. One hit a wherry called Penguin, blew it to smithereens, and in honour of the blown up wherry we have Penguin Dyke. So yeah, a landscape of history. Apparently some of the bombs never exploded and they landed on Home Marsh, and when I'm mowing that, I know old John Ellis, Ted's son, used to come out and say, oh Will, unexploded bombs. I used to say to him, well, if I hit one, we'll have a new pond, we'll call it Will's Pond. Lovely job. But yeah, I mean, this is what it's all about, isn't it? Swallowtails and harriers and bitterns and fritillaries and Norfolk hawkers. But Strumpshaw's got all that. We've got these, found nowhere else in the whole of the UK. A brown beetle called Galaruca laticolis, endemic to Wheatfen. Why it's at Wheatfen, why it's nowhere else, we haven't got a clue. Interestingly, Ted never recorded it. I like to think personally he couldn't have missed it, he just left that one for someone else. But the larvae feed on meadow rue, which is an interesting plant in itself. The adults feed on creeping thistle. And a lot of fens, you think, well, I'll top them thistle, standard practice, trying to reduce the thistle dominance. We leave our thistles, not being lazy, we have this endemic beetle. Another endemic to Wheatfen, a moss called Timeo megapolitana. Again, found nowhere else in the whole of the UK. It has been looked for elsewhere. Why it's here, we just don't know. This was found by Bob Ellis, Ted's nephew and one of our trustees. I would say this particular moss grows in the most dangerous places on the fen, the deepest peat in the Carr woodland, and people do ask to see it, and I reluctantly say, okay, get your chest waders on, because it is a bit of a challenge. On top of that, we have zombies. This is an amber snail, and it's been parasitized by a fluke worm called Leucochloridium paradoxum. There is a test at the end, so I hope these Latin names are going in. I'm terrible on Latin names, it's just, oops, when you say these things so many times it starts to sink in. But yeah, what we've got here is an amber snail. It's been going about its business. Unfortunately, it's munched up some bird droppings. Within the bird droppings are the flukeworm eggs. And the eggs, they go into the snail and they develop, and then they hatch, and they go into the eye stalks of the snail where they pulsate. And what they're saying is, come along bird, reed warbler, peck me out. I want to go into your guts and repeat the cycle, get pooped out and be eaten again by the snail. Ted being Ted, he thought, well, that's fascinating, but what I'm going to do is get one of these snails, get my tweezers, pluck out the flukeworm, just to see if the eye stalk grows back. To his amazement, it did with time, so I guess the only thing there is if a moorhen gets hold of that, the whole snail's gone, isn't it? So, yeah, it does make you feel like you've got itchy eyes. So yeah, my job, conservation management of the fen. A big part of any nature reserve is to manage the habitats as best as we can. Now, some volunteers, they think it's all about drinking tea. Well, there is some days when you drink a bit of tea. It's certainly not about swallowtail selfies. This was done just to annoy someone because they're very anti-technology. But to get a swallowtail selfie, But you know, some days when you are sitting there drinking tea, suddenly you hear noises underneath your little office in the car park. And yeah, then you will know the office sits right next to the car park, which is just here. And the house is just across the way. And you look out your window just here, and to my surprise, there's a family of otters. This actually started in the first lockdown. As warden, I was allowed to patrol the reserve, check no one was driving, walking around with me pitchfork, telling people where to go, but open to the locals for your hour of exercise, of course, which I think many people did really appreciate. And it was a time when I was doing countryside stewardship stuff. And those of you involved with Natural England and the Rural Payments Agency will realise it can be a bit of a headache. A lot of paperwork, none of it seems simple, that may just be me. And suddenly you hear this scratching underneath your feet, and it went on, and then they start squealing. And I've got bloody rats under the floor, and so you get a bit annoyed with it. Days go by, and this squealing gets louder and louder. You think, I'm not so sure. What have we got under here? Cats or stoats? And we set up the trail cameras and, yeah, film the mum, 3 otter cubs. Almost by the hour, 3 o'clock every afternoon, they'll be out playing around in the leaves. I put a bit of straw down. They pulled that under to make a bit of a bed. So yeah, it's amazing. Wheatfen, the wildlife moves into what's there.
You still get them there?
Not really. They've never bred there again. Can't blame them. Next door is the tool shed where we're servicing chainsaws and so on. But they have slept under there occasionally, so they still use it as a bit of a sort of, a roost, for want of a better word. What would you call a place where an otter lives? Holt. I think you're right. Holt. Yeah. Badgers are sets, foxes are earths, otters are holts. Yep. No, it'd be nice to have them back. We have got a brand new office. There is still a nice cavity underneath. So yeah, whether they move back in or not, we shall see. So again, I've got a nice quote from Ted. In a 1985 interview, he stated, this is a year before he passed away, "I wouldn't like Wheatfen to go to someone who would spoil it by gardening, by tidying it up too much. I hope it will go to someone who will look after it by not looking after it, as I have done." Now obviously times move on, and that doesn't give me an excuse to drink more tea. I remember this from my Eastern College days with Jerry Kinsley, who's still a tutor there, and he put this up on a similar sort of slideshow, and he said, "Who thinks this is really good conservation? Who thinks that?" Well, I mean, I looked at it, I'd been working at East Rusnell Vicarage Gardens, and I thought, cool, yeah, look at this, bluebell carpet, looks absolutely stunning. And then he went into a rage. He said, "Will, what are you talking about?" He said, "All these trees are the same age, the same species, they're all probably beech." He said, "Where's the standing deadwood? Where's the fallen deadwood? Where's the shrubs and the bushes and the brambles and the fawns and the hollies?" And he said, "Woodland should be a tangled mass of chaos." And I think that's what Ted meant. You know, if a tree blows over and it's not over a path, why clear it up? If an ash tree is stone dead in the wood from ash dieback and it's not near a path, why fell it? And if all your bramble banks are building up higher and higher, climbing over all the fallen trees and brash, you think, well, there you go, there's something for white admirals and fritillaries. So it's not overdoing it. It's not managing for the sake of it. So yeah, the key to any wetland is its hydrology. And Wheatfen is completely tidal. There's no defence, no banks, no sluices, no pumps, no windmills, nothing like that. The tide comes on twice a day and off. Sometimes it can be extreme, and when it gets extreme, you suddenly think, well, where's the path and where's the dike? The dike is almost bottomless, and if we weren't standing in this picture, it gets very unsafe. So again, we're there to keep an eye on the situation, to monitor things like moon phase. 20 miles from Yarmouth, and we're looking at the moon to decide on how big the tide's going to be. You get a strong northerly, it's backing up the river, stopping it from flowing out, backing it up onto the floodplain, and it's hydrating the fen. And that's what you expect of a floodplain. It protects Norwich, it protects the surrounding villages, and the flora and fauna that can tolerate that is somewhat quite special. However, what's in the water these days? Not the pea soup of the 60s, as Ted described, but still not great. All the research coming out about dog flea treatments being found in the water, Whitlingham Sewage Works upriver discharging, something in the papers today about how many hours of discharge had occurred in the Broads over the last year. Agricultural runoff, nutrient enrichment, eutrophication, no end of litter. Unfortunately, things like needles washed up on the riverbank. Very sad sign of the times. And all of this has effect on the flora and fauna. So what can we do? Well, we have to legally remain as a floodplain. We have to protect various places, of course. We don't expect Norwich to flood because we've had enough. But we can get the water off as quick as possible. Again, under licence from Natural England with relevant permissions, we can get in machines like this, and this is here at the moment, and we can dredge dikes. So the water then can flow off nice and quickly. And with the spoil, we can make new paths, we can make giant banks for kingfisher and water vole, and we can improve our access. It looks quite devastating. It looks a bit like a bomb's gone off when we first do it. But 6 months later, nature being nature, the scars are healed, the valerian, the rue, the loose stripes all poke through, and it looks stunning. And where you can't get a digger, well, we get them volunteers. And this was a grup, a foot drain, meant to be a foot wide, a foot deep, the veins of the fen. Again, it's pulling water on and off the fen, and we dug this one by hand. Some volunteers we never see again after day one. Don't know why. But I mean, yeah, this is the sort of thing you get where you get standing water. So it's nutrient enrichment. We're getting a lot of nettle and reed mace and willow herb, and yeah, we want a bit of that. We all know that there's 4 species of butterfly that lays eggs on nettles, and we all know that elephant hawk moth caterpillars feed on your willow herbs. But what we really want more of is your orchids and your loosestripes and rues and so on, your true rare fen specialists that don't want nasty standing water full of nitrates and phosphates. Wheatfen Broad, split into 2 halves over sort of 40-50 years. They've got badly silted. Again, it's all organic matter building up, the tides washing in silt, and occasionally, unfortunately, we have to step in and do something quite extreme. So Wheatfen Broad, we mud pumped 6,000 cubic metres of silt from the bottom of it. It almost looked like a reed bed. A lovely view by the bench. You couldn't see the water no more. One funny story I shouldn't really tell you with some of my trustees in the room, but we used to have a mum and daughter team, and the mum was like, yeah, send in the daughter, she can get in the old mud. And we'd send her out on some planks to cut the reed so we could see the open water. It was all hovering, all bouncing up and down, but it was all risk assessed, of course. So yeah, the Broad had a good old mud pumping, and again, nature soon takes over. It heals, it recovers, and hopefully we won't have to do anything that extreme for another 50 years or so. And of course, all necessary surveys are done. We know we have a massive collection of rare molluscs that live in the ditches and dikes at Wheatfen. Roy Baker, many of you will know, and Derek Howlett of Rockland spent years surveying Wheatfen, particularly interested in molluscs. And there's some areas, some dikes, where we must almost never dredge or do so in such a sympathetic way because of some of these red data book species. So although it looked drastic when we do such projects like dredging, it's well thought out, licensed from Natural England, and yeah, it does recover very quickly. So the B word, very topical at the moment, beavers. How would beavers help the hydrology of the Broads of Wheatfen, a tidal floodplain? Well, they can't make it any wetter. It'd be very interesting actually. I've been very lucky to study beavers on the Tay, and I've seen many small streams that they've dammed, and that's created pools, and then they've widened them and encouraged willow and coppice willow and so on. At Wheatfen, I don't know if they've changed the hydrology too much because it's already has everything they need. It has the water, it has the willow and so on. Yeah, who would like to see beavers in the Broads? Yeah, not so sure. I think the end concern is in a natural ecosystem, they have predators, they have top predators, and we do not have those predators in Norfolk or the UK. And again, on the River Tay, it was the illegal population which got protection, and they thrived, and they did a phenomenal job. They bred and they bred and they bred, and then they started to flood all the farmland. I'll come to your question in a second. Nothing really in place to subsidise farmers at that time. So what happens in Norfolk in 50 years' time when beavers are just prolific and thriving and doing so much good work, which we know they definitely do? Then we get to the thing of, do we cull, do we trap, do we move, do we kill? And that's the bit that I always think needs thinking through properly before we start to reintroduce things. So, and that's never a nice subject, is it? Do you want to kill a beaver? Because I certainly wouldn't, but there will be an issue if they thrive as they would do. What was your question on beavers?
What I wanted to say, that you talked about whether beavers were doing good down Wheatfen. There's a place down Sculthorpe now.
Yes, yeah, the Hawk and Owl Trust, yeah. They are in a 5-acre pen, although we all hope that they'll get to be released so they can spread up the valley. But again, Fakenham on the doorstep. Fakenham is largely on the edge of a floodplain. If they start flooding Fakenham, so yeah, we need the legislation in place to deal with such issues. But yeah, a few places in Norfolk, Wildken Hill, they've got them, haven't they? And I think there's a little one near Holt, which I forget the name of. Glaven, yeah. So yeah, do a lot of good, but we do need a long-term vision, a long-term plan for should things go wrong. Having said that, go back on my words, the battle against the scrub, a big job for any warden, the willow, the succession. We know that any habitat without enough grazing pressure will revert back to some sort of tree, forest, scrub. So we step in. Now beavers will do a phenomenal job of giving you age structure in willow. So generally at Wheatfen it's ancient car, not been touched for centuries, phenomenal, dripping in epiphytes, or we clear it away because it's stepped too far into really rare fen and we're losing rare flowers. What we'd really want, if money was no object, is to have 1-year willow, 2-year willow, 3-year willow, coppice cycle, a bit like a hazel coppice, structure, dynamic habitats that change and you reset, and beavers would do that. So they would make the scrub, the car woodland, the wet woodland a lot more interesting. But like I say, we do not have these long lost animals of the last ice age. Your aurochs, the wild cows, the tarpon, the wild pony, and moose and elk and bison. And you imagine these vast herds 10,000 years ago raging across the UK. We are still linked to Europe via Doggerland. Vast herds trampling, squashing, resetting ecosystems, perhaps triggering fen to regenerate, to reset, stopping the car woodland from spreading. Again, this is all a bit theoretical. Franz Vera, the Dutch ecologist, has spent decades looking at pollen analysis, what used to be here, how did ecosystems function? Was it predator-led, controlling prey, or was it prey just marching around, shaping landscapes instead? We don't really know. What we do know is, if we step in with some volunteers and do scrub clearance in the right place at the right time, we get some phenomenal results because we're resetting that balance. So yeah, here, start of Wheatfen, 50 yards down the boardwalk. Originally it was a wall of willow. You couldn't see too much. So we surveyed, we looked, we thought it's young willow, it's not been here too long. There's none of that rare moss in there, that Timea megapolitana, because if we started clearing that out of the way, we'd be in big trouble. So we cleared the scrub, and now you can walk down 50 metres of path, get to that point, and suddenly you might have a chance of seeing a swallowtail, or a marsh harrier, or a Norfolk hawk or dragonfly. Again, easy access, fantastic for anyone just to get down to a short area of fen without any great walk, and you're right in the heart of the habitat instead of having a giant wall of willow. But again, you know, it's Wheatfen, it's Ted, it's his legacy. So we're looking at buckthorn, thinking, well, we'll clear some willow, but things like buckthorn that are really slow to grow. The food plant, one of the food plants of brimstone butterflies, there's the caterpillar. Guelder rose, occasional flocks of lapwing, other birds feeding on the berries. Not really dominant, not really something that's going to be invasive and cause us trouble. So again, anything that we do is well thought out. And more recently, willow emeralds, which 10 years ago would have brought great excitement, getting a bit boring now, aren't they? They've been here a long time, they're spreading out up north, but even so, laying their eggs in overhanging willow branches, overhanging wetlands. And you see these scars, each one has got a little egg in there that will drop down in the spring and hopefully into water. If not, they'll squiggle across the damp ground, little nymphs to do their usual year or two in the waterways until they hatch out as a damselfly. So with any scrub bashing, we're not just hacking and slashing. It may appear like that when you've got 10, 20 rowdy volunteers with bow saws, particularly when the bow saws are a bit blunt. Yeah, another big part of the winter season, well, even late summer mowing, is the mowing regimes. And again, very topical for many of you who volunteer or who manage reserves yourself. Various rotations achieve various things. And again, we haven't got these long lost grazing herbivores. At best at Wheatfen, we've got some Chinese water deer, which of course not a native species, but kind of fulfill that role of a little bit of natural grazing. We did look into having some ponies. The problem we've got is access. So we can get our nice hardy wetland conic ponies from Poland here, and they do some phenomenal grazing. We suddenly flood and the water levels come up within 6 hours. We can't drive on site to get these animals off, so a welfare issue. So what we have is wardens with brush cutters and mowers and volunteers with lots of rakes. And again, it's all different cycles. An annual cycle for various rare fen flowers, but also longer cycles for things that take a little bit of time to get established. And then it floods. And we're back in the shed, scratching our heads, doing lots of paperwork. So it's getting more and more tricky with the flooding. It's becoming more prevalent in the winter months. Really holds up our work. And like I say, this is the front of the home marsh. So where we cleared that scrub where I just showed you, sheets of tufted vetch and all sorts of bits and pieces in there. And then we have the burning. Whoa, who thinks this is good? Yeah, well, it's been done for centuries, so it's okay. But no, it has been done for centuries. Burning of waste litter, no value, no good for thatching because we're a fen, we're not a nice tall reed bed. Farmers don't want it for livestock because hay bales, straw bales, are so cheap, if not free, sort of a waste product from barley and wheat. So we mow the fens and we think, well, what are we going to do with all this loose material? We can bung it in holes, we can stack it in habitat piles, and we're still left with acres and piles and piles. If you have any ideas, bearing in mind we can't get anything down our paths but a wheelbarrow. We looked into balers, we looked into all sorts, and you think how much carbon has actually been emitted from such a minor burn. Even so, we must all look to change our ways and do our bit, and we certainly mustn't smoke out the village of Surlingham. So on top of that, we've got these main habitat things like hydrology, scrub bashing and mowing regimes and grazing potentially. And then we suddenly think, well, individual species management, oh, that's a dangerous game. We get some people who get a bit fanatic about one particular thing. You might have someone who loves that Timea megapolitana moss in the wet woodland, never touch the woodland again because it's got this rare moss. Then you've got Galaruca laticolus beetle that loves a fen, so we can't touch the fen either. What do? We've got to do something. We've got to try and manage these habitats to get the best for all these species. And again, just focusing on these. So we've got milk parsley here. How do we manage for milk parsley, the food plant of the swallowtail butterfly, for them caterpillars? I don't think anyone knows. It's a bit of a mystery. It certainly doesn't like an annual cut, although a good heavy cut will encourage it to germinate, to come up. Some trusts like a nice 4-year rotation, but we've always argued, well, it's now coming to its best in 4 years. It wants another 3 or 4 years to get up to an even greater height. There's areas that I've seen that the RSPB manage where they haven't been for decades and the milk parsley thrives. There's areas that they get trashed, in my opinion, by cattle every year, but the milk parsley seems to come up and tolerate it. So we had a lot of students involved, a lot of UEA students, master students looking at pH and what's in the water, crowding and competition, and still not quite sure. And then we've got meadow rue, so like I say, for that Galaruca beetle found nowhere else in the UK. Wanting an annual cut, it really encourages the meadow rue to come through if we give it an annual cut. So in one place we think Galaruca beetle, cut, cut, cut. Another place we think milk parsley, maybe no cutting. And it's where do we do which cut, when, how much of each one, how many milk parsleys do we want, how many meadow rues do you want. You can see we're starting to scratch our heads a bit. And yeah, boardwalks. Access, we've started to replace a lot of our infrastructure. The old decaying boardwalks of the 90s starting to rot away, float away quite literally. Sometimes you turn up, you think, well, where's my bridge gone? So we are looking to replace. It does bring the volunteers into tears. Boots full of water and mud. I say everything at Wheatfen has to be moved by hand. What I haven't told some volunteers in the room is 8 tonnes of boardwalk is arriving tomorrow morning. All of which needs to be drilled, chopped and carted. And we have a wheelbarrow. And I have pumped the tyre up. So yeah, this is we're using recycled plastic. It's meant to be frost-proof, UV-proof, doesn't break down, don't need chicken wire. In theory, doesn't really need any maintenance. It should last. I'm hoping it will last longer than me. It'd be nice to go back in 40 years' time and the old boardwalk's still there. And yeah, really strange stuff to work with, very bendy and flexible. We've realised it's better to do nice curves and get a straight line, because a straight line is almost impossible. This is an old trainee banging in 3-metre piles, because this was an old bit of broad which has long been lost to succession, but we don't want the boardwalk to float away or to sink. He didn't come back. Again, it's all done by hand. There's no tractor there with a nice hammer coming down, a hydraulic ram. It's all done with a post knocker. The first metre, yeah, does go in quite nice in peat, but then, I know in the house they could almost hear the rhythm of the donger, dong, dong. I think it was probably driving them insane after a while as well. It sort of echoed across the whole of the Yare Valley. So yeah, that's some of our sort of management techniques that we do. And then the future of Wheatfen. Well, hopefully this is not the future of Wheatfen. This apparently is me on a mower, getting a bit carried away. But yeah, we are concerned about flooding, and I'm sure a lot of people are. It's a massive problem in the Broads. I've been there 8 years nearly, and I've noticed a difference just in that short time period. We've got volunteers who have been coming for 35 years, and it was a novelty back then. You'd shut the gate 4 times and say, sorry, we're closed, it's too dangerous. Now it's 50 plus times. And yeah, the whole of the Broads, this is how it's mapped at the moment. It's in a similar scenario, really. Our biggest concern is we might go back to this. This is the great Roman estuary of 2,000 years ago. You can see it's all going to be salt water. There won't be any swallowtails. All the things that we've just seen, most of the wildlife we've just seen won't be able to tolerate the saline conditions. I mean, what an estuary it will be. Phenomenal habitat, perhaps an internationally important habitat. Not all doom and gloom, but we lose a very rare internationally important habitat in its place. This was only around for about 400 years. You've got your last ice age 10, 12,000 years ago. Glaciers retreat, form the valleys. Our river valleys are here. Back then, the heavy winter rains would flood vast floodplains. We had shallow lagoons. The Broads were always here. Then we had the giant storms, several years of giant storms 2,000 years ago, swept Yarmouth away. Perhaps no bad thing. We got this estuary. With time, over another 400 years, the sands build back up, Yarmouth appears again, and once again, we're a freshwater system. But I'm sure we've all seen these kind of maps, the predicted sea level rise, the next 100 years, we are going back. It's not too dissimilar, is it, to that estuary? So it is a worry. It's a worry for the wildlife that just won't tolerate such conditions. And it's certainly not Wheatfen's problem as a whole. It's for all of us to get our heads down. Even local farmers. Now this does not look anything like our local farmer. But no, I mean it's a wider issue. We can all do our own little bit, and at Wheatfen we can look at the heights of paths, the heights of boardwalks and other plans that may come to fruition with time. But you know, there's wider things, like a Thames barrier often discussed to stop the salt charging up the valley. Or I greedily look at the marshes along the Acle Strait and think, flood them. There's nothing there, flood them. What a habitat that would be for waders. Stop the salt coming up this high up the Yare Valley. These rare protected habitats. Let somewhere else take some of the water. Other places build their banks higher and higher and higher until they're breached. And then they're in bother. We drain away within 6 hours, they're flooded for weeks. So it's a big problem for everyone, and something that we're looking at now. Here is the time to actually answer some of these problems. And we're very lucky. We've got lots of researchers at Wheatfen, lots of different universities. We've got Alice from Royal Holloway London, and Andy from Leeds have set up all sorts of data loggers. Various data loggers measuring salinity every 15 minutes in the dike, automatically just taking a reading. And you can see here, we all have a graph. We're actually quite stable. It's measured in Siemens, and basically fresh water sits between 0 and 1500 Siemens. Salt water, pure salt water from the sea is 50,000. You see, we sit there in about the 1,000 mark, apart from the odd spike. So it is good quality fresh water. It's not too bad until you read that milk parsley only tolerates 1,000 Siemens, and we're there. Are we going to start to lose milk parsley with time because it just can't tolerate the slightly higher levels of brackish water coming into the system? We also have Salty Stew, phenomenal volunteer, goes around every 2 weeks, 11 fixed points with his handheld salinity monitor to monitor the salt water. Again, it's just data, isn't it? It's data that you can present to the relevant authorities and say, look, this is becoming a problem, or maybe it won't be becoming a problem, but it's no good saying we're worried about seawater in 100 years' time without any clear, solid evidence to say it's becoming an issue. And so you may see on various guided tours all the kit that's installed. The scientists are measuring peat accumulation. For 2,000 years, the peat has accumulated at such a rate that rising sea levels haven't bothered the Broads. Now it's not quite. Sea level rise is rapidly increasing. The peat isn't accumulating. No organic matter can keep up with the climate change that's happening. But again, we need proper solid data to actually present this to the relevant authorities. On a Warden scale, or as fellow naturalists, we can all do our bit with species recording. One particular challenge was to find a new species to the reserve, bearing in mind that we think we've got 8,000–9,000 species recorded at Wheatfen. Thought I'd cracked it with this. Whoa! Ivy broomrape. Came up along the path near the house one year. I thought, yeah, this isn't any of the books. I've never heard nothing about this at Wheatfen. Only a few sites in Norfolk you can find it. I was secretly celebrating, thinking I'd joined the elite, until I spoke to Reg. Reg again at the back. He said, I remember Phyllis sprinkling some seeds about back in the day, and that came up along this bank, and you brought your dredger in and you've disturbed that soil, and now they come up there. Wow. Not to be dismayed, I went on and found these thistle aphids, which again I don't think was recorded at Wheatfen. I never found any records of it. So every year we're finding new species. This particular one was a fascinating one. We saw it every year, a giant Ichneumonid wasp. But it's one of them weird things where we'd say, well, let's get a picture of it, let's get close enough to record it, then we can actually identify it, because we've never seen nothing like it. It was quite an evil looking beast. And several volunteers took pictures of it, and they were all blurred. You know, what's going on here? It's like the Loch Ness Monster, some blurred picture in the distance. One day a volunteer caught one in a jam jar, and we were quite disappointed in a way, because like, oh, the mystery will come to an end. This is Amblyjoppa proteus, which lays its eggs in elephant hawkmoth caterpillars. Injects them in there, the caterpillar goes into the ground to pupates, and out rises Amblyjoppa, who's been feeding on the caterpillar's innards. So there's always new things turning up, always new species to discover. Even when you've got a species list of 1,400 fungi. I'd probably name 50 fungi at best, probably not even that. 1,400 fungi species recorded at Wheatfen, the biggest list in Norfolk, not the UK. I think a site in the Cairngorms has got more. But, and even so, they still find new ones each year. Tony Leach and the Norfolk Fungus Study Group also undertaking DNA barcoding in our study centre. They're extracting DNA in little Wheatfen and getting the actual genetic sequence to identify it and to confirm it is what it is. And just to finish quite quickly on this iconic specimen, the swallowtail, and those fantastic caterpillars. There's one there, probably in its 5th instar and its 2nd instar. Almost like mum and child, but obviously not the case. And well, they've got a lot to put up with. Flooding. How much flooding can they tolerate? We don't know. Some books say they tolerate various days of flooding. I don't think anyone's actually studied it. Obviously the snow, the frost, the cold, the trampling of water deer, non-native species out in the reed bed. Also things like this. Who we got here? Now, it's not the best thing because it's on a trail camera, but there is a swallowtail chrysalis in this picture, and we're now about to see it get eaten by a pheasant. So again, we have a protected, very rare swallowtail being eaten by a pheasant, released. Not necessarily against that. My dredger man gave me a pheasant the other day, which I'm going to have in a stew, but it does show a problem, doesn't it? I'm not going to get into the shooting debate and so on and so forth, but you've got this bird released as a hobby, as a sport, predating on rare protected species. And then to make it even worse, our milk parsley, the food plant of the swallowtail, a few years ago, the whole lot just wilts and dies. Nowhere else in Norfolk, just Wheatfen. What's going on here? Scientists pile in, scientists on Kew, mycologists taking samples away. Volunteers are going out there removing the cutting the foliage off, incinerating it, trying to remove whatever pathogen is attacking our milk parsleys. And to be honest, we're still none the wiser. A couple of fungi species were extracted, and various theories of suddenly these fungi are working together to the detriment of the umbellifer, the milk parsley. Thankfully the plants have recovered since then, and we do wonder if it was a stress at that time, maybe a little leap in saline in salt water, putting stress on the plants, and then the fungi had more of an effect. But we monitor every year, we check. Which brings us on to this. Do swallowtails matter? What do we reckon? Yes. Does any of this matter? They're going to be gone in a couple hundred years. Well, the European one, the subspecies, might come over with our warmer winters, hybridize. You'll have swallowtails in your garden in 20 years' time, perhaps. Don't know. It's an interesting one. We look at these rotations, these mowing rotations, these cycles. Should we cut for 4 years or 10 years or never? And we worry about these wilts and these pheasants. And again, we're looking at that individual species management. But they are an indicator. They show the health of the fen, the health of the ecosystem, and we want to look to translocate, to move them, to get milk parsley to grow elsewhere. It's not just that one species, it's that whole ecosystem. It shows that we are healthy and function as it should be. If we lost them, it would be disastrous. I probably don't need to talk about these because it was the South Yare Wildlife Group which pretty much led the reintroduction of large marsh grasshoppers at Wheatfen. Once a native, once widespread in the Broads and the fens elsewhere, reduced to a few habitats in the New Forest and Dorset, reintroduced to a few sites in Norfolk, nothing like Wheatfen, none of them were tidal floodplains, tall herb fen. And then South Yare said, how about Wheatfen? And we said, well, we'll have a go, why not? And well, some of you here, you citizen keepers, you raised them, you reared them, you released them en masse at Wheatfen. We counted, we surveyed, we saw them breeding, and we wait now for the results in the well, early summer. Will they re-emerge? Will they survive the flooding, the water deer, the trampling, and all the rest of it? Well, we hope so. We can bring things back. Or, in some cases, things will come back themselves. The cranes breeding in the Yare Valley again. Hurrah to the RSPB. It's their side of the river, but we'll still take the glory. But yeah, I'll finish on 2 quotes. One from Ted, well, both from Ted actually. Back in the 70s, Ted grew serious when he wrote in this newspaper, "Our main concern is the quality of human life as well as its bare survival. We stand at the crossroads where grim prospects can be seen. The more of nature we destroy and pollute, the sooner we shall destroy what makes our lives worth living. This is the 70s, and such was Ted, a forward thinker. I think that's so true of today, if not more so. But he also said, to end on a high, however much he learned about Wheatfen, he still saw not facts, not even habitats, but magic. And surely that's what it's all about, seeing that otter, seeing that swallowtail, being out in nature, peace and quiet, fantastic. Thank you for listening.
Wow, Will, what a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
You're very buoyed up by that, and on our doorstep as well. It's great to hear about the breadth of all your work. It's wonderful to see those archive images and the anecdotes. What was it? The tangled mass of chaos and the Mount Everest of Norfolk.
Yes.
Excellent. And you didn't miss out the controversial areas and the challenges of your role and your job, and never mind managing the 50 volunteers going on. I'm sure there'll be questions. I've got one, which is it possible to see any of the Ted Ellis notebooks or images of them?
That's a good question. Now, we do have an annual meeting for members coming up, and you can join the Friends of the Ted Ellis Trust, and there'll be a talk from the, let's get this right, the Norfolk Archivists?
Norfolk Record Office.
Norfolk Record Office, who are going to store all of Ted's archives, and already have some Arthur Henry Patterson stuff, and some of them will be on display, and we're looking to get funding to do a lot more with Ted's archives. To bring them all together will be the main starting point, because they're scattered, and then to run events, to have them on display, to have them on social media. At the moment we're not quite there, but we're certainly working towards it. Yeah.
Well, sounds like you've made a good first step. That's great, thank you. Any other questions? Rupert?
Thanks so much, Will, and you've hinted very clearly at the grim long-term prognosis for Wheatfen in terms of human-induced sea level rise, and you've hinted at some of the possible things we could do to protect against that. Can I just ask you candidly, what do you think is our best bet to preserve Wheatfen for as long as possible? For example, do you think, something you didn't mention but I've heard talk about, do you think there is a prospect that we could have a tidal barrage eventually at Great Yarmouth, and that could provide some secure protection for quite a long time if we don't get too rapid sea level rise?
It's a tricky scenario in the Broads, because the previous winter was so wet. If we had a week of northerly winds and we knew the salt water was going to race up the river valleys, and we shut the barrier, you've got all this build-up of fresh water which has to go somewhere. So yeah, it's a tricky scenario. We did wonder that. I know the Broads Authority have talked about a Thames barrier for many years. The cost is obviously in the billions, probably, if not hundreds of millions. But yeah, it's not as easy as you think, is it? All that fresh water, winter of rain, all the roads, the arable land is saturated. We suddenly shut a barrier and say, no water, you're going nowhere. We're going to stop the salt coming in. So yeah. Would there be a long-term solution? Would you force the water to then erode the cliffs more? Big problems at Hemsby. And then you think, well, what about Horsey and Hickling? The salt water's already coming under the dunes. And you think, well, it's a 100-year problem. Is it a 10-year problem? Several great storms again. That 1 in 100 years storm suddenly being 5 in 100 years or whatever. And we blast the fences away, the dunes away, and it's in. So I don't know really. Sometimes you feel a bit pessimistic. But yeah. I don't know whether a barrier would work. Maybe it's just reinstating more floodplains. We've had a couple of decades of building up banks, building up defences, stopping areas flooding. Maybe now it's time to say, well, actually, let's start reflooding the land. There's acres, hundreds of acres that could be flooded, thousands of acres. So all along them Halvergate marshes, I know they have existing wildlife value, but they could store so much floodwater. But yeah, it's such a question that's well above my head, I'm afraid.
This is pure fancy, but if we could get Ted back tonight, you'd have one question to ask him. What would you ask him?
Great question.
That's a very good question. I would, if we'd had a day to get out and about a bit, I'd say, Ted, what do you reckon? You know, what do you reckon about all this reintroductions and climate change? Yeah, I'll probably put it back on him. What's your advice or thought or you know, hope for the future? It'd be interesting. He's such an intelligent man. I often wonder when I'm hacking and slashing or dredging, what would he think? Because he didn't really like heavy management. He didn't really want a nature reserve with signs and hides. But you think, well, you've got to have something. You can't have people bumbling around with no infrastructure. So yeah, I'd put it back on him and saying, Ted, what do you reckon? You know, where would you go with this? Yeah.
What about, you know, you ought to come down to Wheatfen, and he might be able to tell you give you ideas. You get Chris Packham to come down.
Oh, well, that in itself is a controversial question. Who likes Chris Packham? Yeah.
Ideas what to do.
Well, we are very lucky with our trustees. We already have people incredibly senior in the Broads Authority and from all sorts of backgrounds, former heads of wildlife trusts, people who worked with David Attenborough. So we have an exceptionally good team. But no, I mean, we're always after ideas. If anyone's actually got any genuine ideas, particularly with how to remove reed litter, fires and so on, we're always ready to listen.
Would that, what you chop down, if you made like a thing, would that rot down eventually?
Well, I'm still finding David Nobbs's reed stacks 9 years later, so reed surprisingly doesn't rot down very quick.
More like if you built like a big sort of like compost bin.
Yeah.
And put it all in there, let it rot down. You might then supply for all the wildlife might get.
We do have some big reeds. We do stack at least half of it, I should think. There are some exceptionally large reed stacks, and like you say, certainly like your harvestmen, naturalists and beetle experts, they love to get in them stacks in the spring and have a rummage around. So yeah, definitely stacking more and storing it in places. But yeah.
Then you think then you'll probably get wildlife nesting it and stuff.
Absolutely. Grass snakes love to sit on the top and bask in the sun. Perhaps they lay their eggs in there because it's nice and warm inside from the heat. Yeah, definitely.
At the back.
Thank you. Do the Dutch have anything useful to advise us on?
Well, they are the leading experts, and they drained the Broads originally, as we all know. So, yeah, perhaps, I know again one of our trustees down at the back, you might know him from the Broads Authority, has regular correspondence and some very nice field trips sometimes to the Netherlands. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to know how they're sort of coping and dealing with it. Yeah.
Based upon your experience and observations, do you have any particular views about the benefits or otherwise of nest boxes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't see why there would be any negatives with nest boxes. Would you could think of any negatives?
Can it lead to some sort of imbalance in terms of competition for nesting sites?
Yeah, because I know feeders have been banned from SSSIs. We shouldn't be, and even from gardens, there's a big debate now whether we should be feeding birds over winter. We're artificially encouraging great tits, blue tits to thrive, and then your lesser species like cold tits that can't compete at feeders struggle and lose nest sites. So yeah, that is that's a PhD question, isn't it? A master's degree question of
I'm asking of you.
Well, again, phenomenal question. If we can find someone to answer it.
I'm involved in helping to look after one of your neighbouring sites at Dugan's Marsh.
Oh yes, yeah.
Which is obviously much smaller. But a protected site that's managed by the Claxton's Pitch Trust. It has all the appropriate designations and so on. We have, in fact, I fitted 21 nest boxes there, and the usage in terms of percentage usage is very, very high, which in itself indicates that there is a shortage of natural nesting sites.
Yeah, well, we certainly have a shortage, particularly around Surlingham. Again, we're going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. How many ancient trees were there, ancient oaks and so on, all those natural cavities. These days we see a hollow tree or a tree with a cavity, we think rot, decay, let's do some work to make it safe, particularly near paths and roads. Yeah. So we probably have lost a lot of natural habitat, natural tree hollows and so on. Whether putting up a concentrated amount of bird boxes is a benefit to all species, or whether again we're just encouraging things like blue tits, but then they are spaced out by the territorial calls and food availability. So if the food wasn't there, but yeah, it's an interesting question. Would they be out competing your marsh tits and coal tits, they're all feeding in slightly different ways on different niches, so perhaps not. But no, it all links into that feeder debate. Should we feed birds in the garden? Should we feed birds on nature reserves? Yeah, should we give them homes?
Chris Skinner, he might be able to tell you.
I highly doubt it.
Because he has all his farm down for birds and that, and
Yeah.
different sort of wildlife and that.
Well, no, he does a lot of fantastic work, doesn't he? Yeah.
Do you have any more questions? The back there. Thank you.
I think you mentioned earlier when Ted Ellis was introduced to the Wheatfen site, I think the owner then brought like some mollusks or something, and they were quite diverse. I was wondering, is that just kind of the diversity at the site, or
Yeah.
some other factors there?
No, it was just Wheatfen was so diverse. I guess it was tucked away, unspoilt, largely unmanaged, and yeah, back then it's the age before the heavy pollution and chemicals on the land and so on. I'd imagine much of the Broads is probably in a similar condition. It doesn't show Wheatfen to be superior to elsewhere. It's just you happen to have a top naturalist at the time who started to look. But yeah, again, water quality is so much better, no pollution, and all these mollusks were just thriving, and now they're red list because we've lost those habitats.
How many of those mollusks do you think you've lost completely there since the 60s and 70s?
Unfortunately, I don't think we've got Cockle's original species list. Again, like say, Roy Baker in the 80s and 90s did a lot of research, and Ted. But yeah, what the original list was, again, we have got several rooms, I think, in the Castle Museum full of notebooks and handwritten stuff. And again, it's a dream and long term is to pull all these records out. And then again, it's another master's degree student, PhD student to say, well, this was here in the 20s, what's here now? And you could do it with moths and dragonflies and mollusks, everything really. It would be a phenomenal comparison. Probably be quite a sad comparison because I'm sure we have lost a lot. But yeah, it's just getting all this data sorted first and available.
Any more questions? Shall we make this our last one? There is one. I think that's it. So, could I thank you once again, Will? It's really a wonderful evening, fabulous talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.